Hey, it's Alan. I get asked all the time, how exactly does Kadima help people? There are three primary ways. One, we provide one-on-one personalized career coaching with a focus on getting you a great job. Two, we provide an online do-it-yourself course where you can work at your own pace. Three, if you have a job offer, we'll help you negotiate for more. So to find out about these great services and everything else that we offer at Kadima, sign up for our newsletter. Go to syckpodcast.com. That's SYCK podcast.com. I promise you, it'll be the best newsletter to accelerate your career. Thanks a lot.
Live from Brooklyn, welcome to the Sick Podcast, starring Alan Stein, where he steers your career with Kadima. Along with Alan, I'm Russ Reba, and we often talk with those in the tech industry. We shift a little bit today into finance. Now, you have to listen to what Nirupa has to say in her conversation with Alan. Good stuff. But before we get into that, what's new in Alan's world? I know you've got some kids that are starting to drive and starting to navigate with boats, and what's the latest?
Yeah. So recently I took Jonah for his driver's test. Lucas is still a little behind the curve. And for a reminder, I have twin boys. They're both 16. And Jonah failed pretty miserably in his test. So it's good that he's learning his lessons early on.
Well, when you say failed pretty miserably, I'm going to ask you if he failed as miserably as my 16-year-old who just took his test did so with making a 3-point turn backwards and instantly failing and having to do a retake.
That's pretty impressive that he can do it backwards. It's hard enough for me to do that forward.
Oh, you know what? Let me rephrase it.
Passed him.
It wasn't backwards. You're supposed to start your 3-point turn by turning the wheel left. He turned the wheel right. Not in reverse, but he went the wrong way.
Okay. So Jonah hit his 3-point turn, but he failed his parallel park, and at the end, the driving instructor asked him to put his hazard lights on. And Jonah didn't even know what the hell hazard lights were, nor where to find them. So live and learn, but similar to the job search, there is no downside of applying or taking the test multiple times. So I'm going to be taking Jonah again in a couple of weeks. Hopefully next time he will pass, and hopefully he will learn from this experience of his miserable failure.
Well, I'm sending good thoughts your way. All right, so let's get into this sick podcast with Nirupa.
So I'm really excited to have on the podcast today Nirupa Umapathy. You are the first. Are you cousins with Vic?
I am.
Cousins. You are the first cousin I've had. The cousin pairs. I've had brothers on 2 separate interviews, but this is a first cousin. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. Vic was nice enough to introduce the two of us. I've gotten to know you a little bit over the past few weeks, and I've been really impressed with your career, your thoughtfulness in terms of the path that you've taken. And I think it's interesting for our listeners to hear how you've made some of those decisions. But before we go into that, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Like, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, and we were just talking before we started recording here about how you had a pretty traditional, or I would say a pretty traditional career in the finance space. And most of our listeners are in the tech space, but love to hear your overview and background of your career.
Absolutely. Nice to see you again. And thanks for having me. And I know I'm going to be a bit of a loner or contrarian voice on this. Very honored to be interviewed on a podcast, that showcases technologists and those with technology careers. I write, so I want to use technology from the standpoint of something that enables. So from that standpoint, perhaps my lens can be on how I have enabled my life to be one of mission and autonomy now. Originally from India, and I came here when I was 18 to study, and I studied anthropology and economics. I really honestly just wanted to go into development and be in a more mission-oriented career back then. Because of the pragmatics of an H-1B, I'm an immigrant, I decided that pursuing a career as an anthropologist wouldn't be the most pragmatic thing to do. So I interviewed as a sophomore for internships in finance, and I got recruited very early into finance on the trading floor, where I ended up spending about 14 years of my career, or 13 actually, as a fixed income salesperson. I come from a lower middle class family in India. No one had any idea what I did. For the majority of my career, I really don't think I explained what I did to my parents very well. They didn't really understand it. It was quite esoteric and arcane in places. In 2017, I kind of upped it and left the very traditional blueprint of what society kind of labels as accomplishment and success, which is, your job, your title, your promotion, the money that you make, the life that you live, all the things that I think a traditional capitalist society aspires to. I ripped the Band-Aid off on that. And I've sort of been I'm on my own path now and kind of redesigning a path that has no formulae explicitly. I'm learning to become more of an artist, and I'm learning to become more of an entrepreneur. And it's messy, it's glorious, it's terrifying. It really requires you to kind of put your money where your mouth is almost every day, because you create your own structure.
Nice. So I'd love to start with the trading floor. So I used to work in Wall Street back in the good old days. I used to be an equity analyst. I used to walk along the trading floor, and it felt like a men's locker room in terms of the testosterone, the egos, the schism there, and other things. And I remember there were a few women on the floor, but it was mostly men barking orders, yelling at people, very tense. I'd love to hear if how your perspective is as a woman on a trading floor. I'm assuming you were in a minority as a woman on the trading floor.
Oh yeah, I was. Strangely, the gender didn't intimidate me as much. I was born in a family of athletes. My father coached cricket, and he kind of brought me up to be sort of very much like a boy. So I've always been very androgynous and very athletic. In the trading floor, the metaphor for performance is that they call it a team sport and they call it an athletic sport. In a way, it doesn't have the kind of polish that you associate with investment banking. So it was very rough and tumble and rowdy. It reminded me in some ways the streets of India. I remember during my internship, I walked in and, there was a trader that was pretty mad and he broke the phone. And that was not the only phone that I saw, having been broken during that summer. The thought of working with men didn't intimidate me as much but I'm terrified of conflict. And that was I was head on dealing with conflict day in and day out. And I think that it was a very uneasy piece. I was never at peace with that. And as a salesperson, your job is to reconcile between your trader wanting to make money and your client wanting to make money. Both, it's basically like a zero-sum game that you're trying to negotiate and arbitrate. So one person is always going to be unhappy. So the fact of conflict and kind of balancing that was very uncomfortable for me. And the second thing is, I wasn't a trader, but the stakes are very high. You're dealing with a shit ton of money, as you know, and one act of miscommunication, misunderstanding means that you're putting your desk at risk for loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And very early on, I had to learn to get comfortable with that. Failure meant losing a lot of money. So two very big lessons learned, I think, which influenced me. I was very ambitious and aggressive, and I was pretty good at asking for the order. So I think I became much more self-conscious as a woman as I progressed in my career. In the early days, I was very sort of unself-conscious, very driven. But I think as you climb the ranks, you're reminded of a certain kind of stereotype of how you carry yourself and what asserting authority looks like. And that didn't necessarily always cohere with my personality.
So you mentioned that you were aggressive, I think the term that you used.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a negative connotation that women are called aggressive versus men are called assertive often. Do you differentiate what assertion is versus aggression?
It's one and the same for me. I've always been extraordinarily goal-oriented. An example of what I mean, and this is why the culture was perfect for me, because in a trading floor, they always say that the saying always is ask for the order, which means you pick up the phone, you speak to your client, you ask for the trade, or you transact the trade. Similarly, when it came to promotions or negotiating your pay, you pretty much are expected to kind of stand up for yourself and ask for the order. From that standpoint, I was very one point focused. And the same thing went about as it concerns mentors and sponsors. I was very direct in networking and approaching people. And it was not a skill that I had naturally. I had the good fortune of training through an internship program called Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, where they kind of put you through a summer boot camp. This was for like bringing in minorities into finance and law and consulting.
Just like SEO?
Yeah, SEO. And one of the first things that they always said was your network is your asset, right? So one of the most important facets of what I think really contributed to the success of my career, especially in its early stages, was really learning how to be authentic but very direct about building relationships and, seeking mentors. So it was aggressive, and I will give you a funny story which has nothing to do with a career, which is in the dating scene. And I'm no longer married. I remember coming straight out of the trading floor and trying to date in the New York City area was so difficult because I was too impatient waiting for the guy to ask me out. And I would propose a date and it didn't always fly. And so I think that where it kind of backfires is, where it backfired is probably in a more traditional social code. The trading floor was very much meant to be unruly. So I think that the more direct you were, the better it was. And in fact, I was criticized for later on in my life after I became a managing director and I was running a small team. I was criticized for not being aggressive enough in kind of calling people out or dressing them down or basically negotiating conflict. Like if someone pissed you off, to be able to go up to them, and I wasn't able to do it. So somewhere along the line, somewhere along the way, I do think that it doesn't cohere with my personality. Positive things and asking for positive things which are very direct, which don't involve taking a lot from another person. I think it's easier for me to be aggressive and assertive. Things where you're playing politics or things where you're having to fire someone or things like that, I think that I'm definitely, much more soft tone on that, much more human centric.
Where do you think you got that aggressive streak or comfort with being aggressive or assertive? Like some people might have, like you said, it was encouraged in that dynamic, but not everyone can be told, be more assertive, be more aggressive, and just do it. Is there anything unique about your upbringing or the culture or your background that has enabled you to be successful in a very aggressive environment of the trading and the banking world?
I think that India growing up at that time was definitely not. It was very contrary to what the idea of a young woman growing up in India was. That's one of the reasons why I left India. I was probably just a little coloring too much outside of the lines. I was very lucky to have a father who was a coach. And he talked about everything, and he likened everything to playing a game and showing up and winning and losing and really being very unfazed and unflappable. So I think he taught me very young to learn to fail, even though I was terrible at it. He taught me very young to show up and play a good game. So in my head, asking for the order was playing a good game.
A good game of cricket or?
No, I'm just saying whatever the game was, you know what I mean? So on the trading floor, it means if you're going to have to get through the analyst program to go into the associate program, if you want to be a top 10 salesperson, right? For me, all of it was very competitive and all of it was in the format of a game. That's how it was sitting in my mental accounting. I never looked at myself as aggressive. If I did, I think that would have made me very unself-conscious, Alan. And I hear of women being described many different ways if they're really aggressive. And if, strong women can get quite a stigma, they can get stigmatized. But the thing that I almost always did, because I'm very relational, is I made sure that I understood and invested in getting to know someone before I asked them of something from very early on. And so in some ways, I didn't come across as transactionally aggressive. I came across as just someone that knew what they wanted and someone that the second thing that I would always follow up with, I would ask for something and I would always be like, how can I be of help to you? How can I be of service to you?
Yeah.
And so it was always this very, very codified reciprocity and this relational aspect that I built very early on.
Yeah. How did you get to know people to get comfortable enough to ask them questions?
So that was a function of where I grew up. The trading floor, the way I basically started my career in Solomon Smith Barney before it became Citigroup. And it was terrifying, actually, now that I think about it. The internship was set up the summer internship was set up as a one-day round robin. You go rotate from one desk to another. So essentially every day you're dating a different desk. And you did that for 20 to 25 days where you literally had to please people and impress them on the spot, like sit with like 5 to 7 extraordinarily busy people that are like in the market and impress them and try to not take too much of their time at the same time. Kind of ask them good questions. So it was kind of interviewing bootcamp one-on-one. And through that, it just became an immense network. So when I started full-time, we already knew everyone. But I think I stayed in touch with almost everyone. I really had like this very deliberate list of people that I really connected with, that I knew were going to be supporters. And I stayed in touch with them all the way through my career. And some of my later jobs came through those relationships. I do this even now. I look at everything through the eyes of relationship building and networking. Travel, networking, relationship building. Like every life opportunity, a conversation is the basis or the potential for a partnership. And that's the kind of the way that I look at things.
And you said, I think when you were part of SEO, they taught you, I think your network is your asset. What does that mean to you? And then how have you applied that through your career? It sounds like you are very intentional about investing and building these relationships, but I would love, like, when you heard that in SEO, like, how old were you when you heard that term, and did that change you in any way, or were you always a natural networker or relationship builder?
20 to 21, I think, when I did that internship, I've always been social. The first basis of that kind of networking was very ambition-based, which is kind of transactional. They basically say, like, your job at the end of the summer is to get a job. So you interviewed, and they also had you interviewing through multiple investment banks. It was part of the program. And so that kind of networking was much more goal-oriented networking. But what it did, though, was it built up a certain muscle within me where I became unfazed about meeting new people and telling them my story. Part of that was to give you a quick, like, 1 to 2 minute pitch, right? So I got very good at doing that. I'm probably terrible at doing that now, but at that point in time, it was a goal and it was the pitch. And so it was kind of building the muscle memory. That was super transactional, if you ask me, and I'm not criticizing it. It was just a very good skill to have. As I became a salesperson, I think it became more than networking. It became more about investing in relationships, and the capital in that kind of situation is trust. How do you build trust, and how do you inspire trust? And with my clients, it was consistently having the intelligence to show them the right deal, and not just like throw anything at them and expect that things sticks, right? To be very curated in what you showed. And giving them the confidence that you were a salesperson that was good at sourcing deals and you can help make them money. With the trading desk was a different thing. The trust was about, I've got your back. I'm not going to like stuff you with a terrible trade. I'm not just going to bring you a client that consistently doing trades on terms where the desk is losing money. Networking there is making sure that you are exposing just the right kind of firm resources with the right kind of decision maker, the client. It was not always taking my trader and my client out for drinks. I never did that. But it was a combination of picking the right people to be at the table to meet socially, which also involved, like, it's a little bit of a dating game, right? Like, you kind of want to pick the right chemistry. And the second thing is also creating situations that were conducive which brought out the best in people. What I mean by that is I worked in structured products. A lot of my clients were much more quantitative and nerdy. I don't think that a lot of them didn't want to go out golfing or eat steak dinners. They cared about very different things. And so it was about creating the right setting to really bring the best out of everyone at the table, if that makes any sense. The networking now, by the way, is purely just like, it fuels my curiosity, it fuels my writing. I don't think about it as networking anymore, because networking now has this very sort of transactional connotation in my head. I just call it building connections and expanding connectivity. And what I mean by that, I traveled very extensively in 2017, and I traveled deliberately to experience cultures and ways of living that were so antithetical to the way I lived, to break my own patterns, to expand my own horizons. And that's kind of the way I think about networking now. It's really for the joy of human connections. You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know if that really helps. This one is not very useful for a lot of people, but it gives me such joy to connect on a good idea, a good conversation, and connecting on a good idea and a good conversation perhaps then springs off into something else, where Alan would be like, I think that I'm going to call Nirupa on that. You know what I mean? But that isn't intended. That's a byproduct. It's not, I'm not coming into this approaching Alan saying like, I want to make sure that he knows that I'm in this Rolodex.
Yeah, it's interesting that you called networking like building relationships, or I think you might have called it something else similar to that. But that's what I see it also. You're developing and building relationships. Networking sounds like a dirty word. And like I think you referred to it as transactional. And when they say your network is your asset, talk about how investing in that asset, and you were 21 when you heard that, and I'm sure you didn't start building your network then, but maybe you kind of put it a little bit on turbo boost and understood the value of it. Talk about in your career from 21 on, how you've benefited from some of the network and relationships that you've built. Like think about either some of the jobs that you've gotten along the way or promotions. Can you think about ways that investing in relationships have paid off?
It started out, almost all the career opportunities were through a relationship. It never really applied. I haven't changed jobs that much to really use that as a data point. It's not like I had like 25 different jobs. No, I only have had 2 or 3. All of them were relationships that opened doors, and they were all sort of like short-circuited the traditional kind of recruiting process. Being considered for a promotion, being considered for an opportunity as it concerns mobility, it came from that coffee conversation, which was a check-in and saying, hey, this is what I've been up to. This is what keeps me up at night. This is what wakes me up in the morning. Very deliberate sort of like, this is what has me excited. This is what I'm not so, that I'm hoping for. Those kinds of conversations really were the basis for jobs. For instance, like becoming a managing director, it was your performance and your results only mattered up to a certain point. It was a committee that basically evaluated you on multiple things. And one of it was how you carried culture. I naturally had an enormous network through the different affinity groups, through all my recruitment. I did a lot of recruiting when I was in finance, recruited a lot of young women into finance. So the profile that I had, I'm sure, when they were considering me for promotion was here, she made this much money as a producer. But my social capital was probably as important and as significant, if you will, as my financial capital at that point in time. I would say in terms of now, I'm an independent investor, and much of my deal flow comes from just knowing people, and I invest alongside good investors. Whether it is investing through a friend who's a CEO of a new startup, or a deal that someone else is going alongside. It's very much an important part of my risk-taking decision in terms of how good is that person as an investor. How good is their due diligence process? So I would say that is a second way that my network comes in as an asset. Third is I write and I collect stories. I am constantly looking for a story or looking to meet artists, either to invest in art and or like for my salons. I do salons in the arts, and I'm consistently and constantly looking for an interesting story that's going to light up a screen and that is going to make a difference in someone else's life. And travel. The last thing I want to say about it is it is through networking and some of these open source ways that I actually I don't do that anymore now, but finding lodging and couch surfing and doing this, tried a lot of that as well.
So how have you managed to, you mentioned a couple of different attributes there. One, sincerity and following up. The other about asking good questions. So on the follow-up, I'm assuming you're a good follower-upper, and that served you well in your career. Are there tips or things that you do? Because you have this big growing network and you have lots of relationships. How do you effectively follow up with individuals that you need to follow up with?
For the thank you note, almost always, I make sure that it's not generic and commoditized. I will try to think of 1 or 2 things that really resonated and highlighted, and now I do even more with a sense of gratitude for what I learned from someone. That's my lens now. I always do that. I will inevitably update people. It's one of those things where I don't expect them to have a call back with me, but I will always update them. The third thing that I sometimes do, Alan, and I do enjoy this about me, is I might be reading an interesting article, listening to an interesting podcast, and that might just be I was just thinking of you on this and this and this, and I'm sharing this with you. I try to kind of take the pressure off someone to want to have a follow-up meeting or a call with me, but I will drop a line and make sure that they know that I was thinking of them, not like in some kind of contrived fashion. I don't have a mechanistic way of doing things like this. The thank yous are always sincere. I'm also equally not timid about reaching out just from a point of curiosity to someone cold. I've cold emailed so many people saying like, I was on your website and I love this, blah, 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 blah. I would really love a conversation with you. And they've ended up being like deep friendships. But that confidence is now. I don't necessarily know that I would have done that when I was 23 or 24. But every little action emboldens you, right? But thoughtfulness and non-transactionally letting someone know that you're thinking of them through some very thoughtful way, I think people really appreciate that. And there was one time, and I do this every few years. I love a book, and I don't remember, The Secrets of Happiness, or it's a little tiny book, and I sent it off to like 20 of my girlfriends. And so like every 2 years, I'll do this book thing too. Like, I mean, it's a little book that really like touched me. I would send it off to people, including people that I've just met. Just send them a gift. Like,
what's the name of the book?
The 10 Rules of Happiness, I think, and her name is, oh my God, it's a New York Times bestseller, and I'm going to have to send it to you. I did something very cheesy last year, which is, there's a book called The 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak, and it was given as a gift to me, and I sent it to 20 of my single friends. And I said, this is my love talisman for you. When I was doing the 10 Rules of Happiness, I did that. Like, so I do these book things, and these are just like little gifts out of nowhere, and it's, you know.
Yeah. Have people done that to you? And it like, are there things like that, or like, what inspired you to do little things like that probably have a huge meaning in other people's lives?
People have always been very generous with me, Alan, and the way I was mentored, the way I was sponsored, the way I will say that I wouldn't be here without the grace of relationships and people supporting me and backing me up at different points in my life. I can never forget that. So without each one of these incremental senior relationships that brought me to a certain place, I wouldn't be here. So I walked through my world very mindfully, saying that there was a ton of social capital that was gifted to me. It is my turn now to create community. And I do this a lot through the work that I do with my salons, where really try to open up an audience from a different market to an artist who does not have, like a following here. So I do a lot of reaching out to independent and emerging talent, so to speak. That's my way of paying back. One of the manifestos of our salons is to be seen and to be heard is one of the greatest gifts. So in every conversation, I think if I choose to interact with someone, I make sure that, we give them the gift of being seen and heard. It's by paying attention, by being curious, by listening, by asking directed, good, solid questions, and looking one step below the obvious and asking sometimes things that other people might not ask, Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but...
No, it does. And you mentioned that you were very involved with recruiting. I think you went back to Smith College and maybe some other recruiting. There are tons of people that are probably clamoring for your attention and for whatever bank you're at's attention. What made some people stand out that you might put them on like the yes pile? And what made some people stand out on the negative side of like, hey, let's blackball this person? Because I know, not blackball per se, but I've been part of recruiting at Google and Facebook, American Express, and Salesforce. We weren't on site because of COVID. But I had clear directives from the campus recruiting team of, if you see anyone really good, put them on this list. If at one of the companies I worked at, I forget which one it was, they're like, if anyone does anything off-putting, let us know that too. I'm just curious, like, if you guys had any formal evaluation of that when you went on campus and got involved in recruiting, and what would put someone in the positive pile versus the negative pile. And you mentioned some of the things now, but in that quick moment of time where you're on campus or you're doing these recruiting events, what, like, if you think back of someone that really stood out to you, what did that man or woman do?
They did, yeah. So with finance, I mean, I definitely, for the trading floor, they had to have done their homework on market indicators and where the Fed is, like, like very obvious benchmarks, right?
Even just at like a recruiting event.
We didn't do a ton of, listen, the recruiting event was really about how quickly, no. So the recruiting events were hard because we would go on campus, but we mostly just showed up for the interviews. But in the networking events, I honestly was only looking for the bullshit factor. And, it's hard for me to tell you like how you can glean this or that. Someone that is able to, and sales and trading, is very relational. So if a person can't hold a very good conversation within a 5 to 10 minutes, and if they don't have good leading questions, I think it's a bit of a strike, So, but when it comes to the interviews, homework, and if they didn't know things like the stock price of Bank of America or the investment bank that they were interviewing for, if they didn't know, they couldn't just be like switching the same question with Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. I wanted to hear something that was very highly curated for the employer that they were. Have they been on the website? Have they not just been on the website at surface, but have they really been following have they done a deeper dive into the website? Homework was the second one. I would say the third one was, unfortunately, the storytellers I had a soft corner for, like people that were able to tell a good story and weave a good story from where they came from and the why of their decisions, even including what courses they took and how something had an impact on them. The narrative was very important. I mean, you're always selling, Alan. You know what I mean? You might as well start at the interview, right? Like, so a coherent, a cogent, well thought through narrative always impressed me. Because I'm not that kind of a learner, I hated asking people questions like, what were your weaknesses? That question really irritated me because it's not a place, it's a loaded question and it's not really a genuine question, right? So I tried to avoid things that would set up the candidate for failure. My way of interviewing almost always was to make them feel at ease. But at the same time, once they were at ease, I wanted to see how they performed and how they were able to extract the essence of who they were, right? And why they were there. I always ranked them and judged them per the questions. You could have a terrific interview and someone with a 3.95 GPA or a 4.0, and if you had a lame question, you're out. I'm sorry. Like, I think the question says a lot about someone,
Do you have some go-to questions? Like, you don't like, what's your weakness? But are there some go-to questions that you typically ask on interviews across your?
It's very sort of, it follows up. I will almost always ask them, I'll tell them like, tell me the highlights of, I don't want to read your resume right now. I just want you to give me like kind of the highlights of your life. Right. And I will see them within the 3 minutes where they paused and started. And I almost always would drill into understanding if their interest in finance was sort of gimmicky or if it was natural or it was authentic. I almost always asked them about challenges that they had. While I didn't like the weakness question, I did ask them about mistakes that they made. And that's a good bullshit like filter too. Like someone that made no mistakes, I'm sorry. That's a strikeout. The market stuff was very sort of cut and dry. Like there was no like guessing around it. If you didn't know where certain things were, then you're out. I will give you a flip of one thing that I think we did a good job of. At that time, Smith was sending a lot of international students to these finance interviews. A lot of them were Chinese and a lot of them were learning English on campus. So they would get dinged massively in these like sales and trading interviews where they were being basically compared against someone that spoke English fluently. And so one of the biggest things that I think we bucked the trend on was the Smith team or the Seven Sisters team. They basically said, you shouldn't be like judging these kids based on their language proficiency. You've got to understand that they picked up like this language in the last 2 years when they came on campus. So we did a lot of unconscious bias type trainings. And so a lot of my questions also ended up making sure that we weren't kind of socially putting people at a disadvantage. The mistakes that you made question was huge for me. And so like when someone tells their story,
you don't want someone to say you've made no mistakes because everyone's made mistakes, but what are you looking for in that answer?
Like, I'll give you what I think is a good answer, right? If you were interviewing me today and if you asked me what is a mistake that I made, I would say that in my last hedge fund job, one of the sore mistakes that I made was that I didn't do my due diligence on whether my values were aligned with that of the firms that I was joining. For me, that's a sincere answer. It was a truth. Yeah. Right. And then would I say after that saying, as a result of poor due diligence, it ended up being a poor investment and we ended up separating and parting ways. Would I say that in an interview? Maybe not. But I would probably start out by saying that was a failed case of due diligence. The other mistake that I made, another example I can give you, was in my summer internship, and I did this at Merrill Lynch. I was very hung up on wanting to get a job in credit derivatives, which was a very sexy product at that time. There were 4 other people vying for this job. In the meanwhile, another desk had offered me an offer for the summer, and I turned it down because I was so head-on interested in this other job, and I didn't get the internship. So that was a decision-making example or an illustration. Would I have the courage to say that in an interview when I was 25? It's hard, and that's why I think it's a very illuminating question for young people.
Yeah. So you point out one, like, as you answer that question, one of your mistakes was not doing proper due diligence, and you were misaligned with the values and the culture of the organization. How did you improve that after that? Like, or how do you recommend for people to assess the values and cultures of a company? Now there's Glassdoor and there's other things online, but how do you effectively do that? What would you have done better in that situation, or how do you advise other people you work with of how to effectively assess the values and culture of an organization?
I think that it's a tough one because you can't. Okay, actually, this is a nuanced question, because if you had invested in content strategy, and your website should basically illustrate your values, and but the problem is most of digital assets, or whatever the outward facing thing about a company, ultimately is going to be highly glossy and brochurized, right? It's impossible to pick up these critical aspects of culture by looking at the surface. I think that there is no replacement for conversations with employees. And one of the things that I think, when I look back on this, when I was interviewing for this job at this hedge fund, I interviewed only the partners. I did not speak to anyone in sales or in business development. One of the I don't know how you would find this, but I think one of the ways to judge is turnover. What is the average retention? And I think that this is a question that you can probably ask HR. Retention rates of employees, what is the longevity of employees? This place had been a revolving door. And I would have picked up on the pattern, if I had just spoken to a few people. Nothing replaces conversations. And I think that to pick up on culture, I think my recommendation, and I don't know if it's possible or not, is to ask HR if you could speak to 4 people in 4 very diverse departments across very different ranks, and speak to more junior people.
And that's when you're further along in the process. Probably while they're interviewing you, you have less leverage there. Maybe after they're making you an offer, or maybe you're down to the final, then you have a little bit more leverage. Would that be the case? I
would say so. Or yeah, absolutely. Otherwise you're kind of stuck with whatever is Glassdoor reviews. Glassdoor reviews are pretty good, aren't they? They're fairly anonymous, and you learn a lot from it. I think that they're very telling. They really are.
There are some companies that are hard to tell, because a company like Amazon that has 1 million employees, I think they have 100,000 reviews on Glassdoor, and there's very different type of employees there. There's people that work in the headquarters, and there's people that work in the distribution centers and delivery. And there's a very different, almost a caste system of employees at a company like that. But for other companies like a Google, I think it's fairly.
I'm very biased about this, but some of these big branded names that are also big share, they have large market caps in the market. In the investing community and to investors, they already have a brand. I don't want to name any names, but you know what I mean? It's very clear on where we have had values-based violations on governance and where you have not. Mm-hmm. Looking back on that. So, but and again, it goes back to how senior the position is that you're interviewing for. If you're looking for a mid-level position or a junior level position, I think you have to pay a lot of attention to those Glassdoor kind of reviews. I think that if you're going in for a fairly senior position where a lot of your capital is at risk in terms of stock options and such, I think you have to look at the financial equity of the company as well. What I mean by that is not market cap. Amazon has its reputation. Facebook has its reputation. Wells Fargo has its reputation. You know what I mean? The market is a leading indicator of social capital, if you think about it. But that's a senior level kind of consideration to take into account.
Yeah. So something we spoke about.
And by the way, that's a headline screen. That's a headline screen, right? Think about all the violations that a company has had in terms of governance, labor, and risk. Just make sure that you scrape through to a Twitter feeds and you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, it's tough now because all these companies have at least one or two high-profile incidents. It's almost impossible to be fully clean.
Yeah.
So then you have to balance looking at anecdotes versus a larger swath of data. But it is hard. Like I worked at Facebook, I worked at Google. They're very different cultures there, even though from the outside, people think that they're the same. And Facebook, I always felt like we were drinking the Kool-Aid, whereas Google, I felt more open to challenge authority. But anyway, so off camera before we started here, you were talking a little bit about your either a mantra you live by or a philosophy about cutting your losses. And you talk a little bit about mistakes you might have made in the past of misjudging the culture or the values of a company. So thinking about your comfort of cutting losses, how quickly do you make decisions of in that company that you joined that you were misaligned with the values? How quickly did you identify that? And then how quickly did you say, okay, I'm going to cut my losses and move on to something else?
It depends on if I made the same mistake twice. If I'm making that mistake for the first time, I was in therapy for 7 years before my ex-husband and I got divorced, and at around the same time I left financial services. It took me a very long time, but when the time came and I felt ready, it was a clean rip-off of two very significant band-aids for me. For me, I'm one of those decision makers where I have to gather a lot of data points. In the absence of data points, when ambiguity still holds, then I know that I'm not ready to make the decision. The decisions are becoming easier now for me to make in terms of cutting losses. I work as a consultant, and I know within 6 months, if a culture is going to be a fit for me or not. And I don't mean this in terms of people and values. I just mean in the way of work at this point in time. When it comes to investing, it's easier for me. It's just very objective. It's easy for me to put money to work. I will do my research and I'll put money to work. When I see a bad trade and I know I'm in a bad trade, I'm pretty quick to exit.
Yeah, it's a lot more tangible information there versus these not ambiguous, but a little bit harder to define, like marriage or a career in finance or something like that.
Yeah, and I would say that when I got divorced and I left the financial services company, my net worth that year dropped 50%. And after having gone through such a significant net worth drop, I knew that I could survive again. So meaning the next time I have to leave more money on the table, I know that I already survived that. That's what I mean. Have I done this before or not? If that's the first time, it's going to take me a lot longer to do it. It's, so I won't be, I'm not afraid of walking away from a sizable financial gain now because I've experienced loss.
So do you think this allows you to make quicker decisions because you're comfortable of, if you make a mistake, you'll walk away?
I don't know that quicker is always good in every case. Sometimes I think I'm a very firm philosophical believer that the time will present itself to you when you have to, when it's an obvious decision. So I'm not always trying to make quick decisions unless it involves mental health issues or physical safety issues, in which case I should. But yes, if I've seen the pattern before, it's easier for me to make the decision. I will tell you, for instance, when a relationship is out of alignment or apart, it's not going to be a good partnership or it's not going to be a good click. I can see it. Right? Because I've seen those patterns multiple times before. As a salesperson, I know when someone is going to put money to work and when someone is not. You know what I mean? So I'm not overly optimistic. So there are certain pattern-based data points that I'm confident in. Risk and governance, I can see it when someone's a risk and governance is off. That kind of hygiene. And that's maybe because I'm kind of honed in on that, So I think very carefully, even in friendships or relationships where someone is making very poor decisions that is going to jeopardize the health and the happiness of their immediate circle.
Yeah. So you talked again that your network is your asset, and you also often talk about how investing in yourself. So you look at a lot of these things in a financial lens, and that probably from where you've spent a lot of your career. I know you said you make a very important point of investing in yourself.
Yes.
How have you invested in yourself along your career? And how do you advise other people to invest in themselves? Like whether it's time, money, therapy, whatever.
I think I sort of invested too much time in my career at the expense of like the loss of human relationships. So I'm not entirely sure that I would repeat that, like to be so obsessive about your career that, you let it consume your life. I think that one thing I would take away from that playbook always to invest in the relationships from across all levels, senior levels down to junior relationships, because having the community, not only are these people in your network, they also are the community that I realize that the sense of belonging is very critical when that kind of can be the make or break in, even if your job is stressful and miserable, having that self-care in terms of your own confidence, having outlets outside of the job, which includes having diverse circles of being exposed to different ideas of what lights up someone, right? And I spent a lot of time I do a lot of yoga, and I used to do a lot of Pilates when I was in finance, and that greatly enhanced my confidence physically and physiologically. I would say therapy was always a very core thing that I had for a very long time. I would say investing in myself now, I think of it as 3 legs. Financial capital, obviously, my finances pay my bills, so I am on top of it. Social capital, which we already talked about, the community, and making sure that you're creating intentional reciprocity, and you're also curating people in your circle that are going to push you to a point of growth and that are aligned with you in terms of values, right? So I don't have a lot of one-way trades in my relationships. What I mean by that is I don't just necessarily have people that just want to be like receivers. I have a lot of givers and receivers in my community, and my closest relationships constantly push me to edges of discomfort at points, which I really enjoy. And the third thing is creative capital. To consistently show up with the spirit of taking creative risks and to show up with the spirit of experimentation and curiosity. So my circles almost always mirror the intentions that I'm trying to create for every year. So for the last 2 to 3 years, I've been surrounding myself more with sort of like creative entrepreneurs and designers and people that definitely, I was trying to learn a new muscle, right? So also I've changed my habits as well. I want to lead a more minimalist lifestyle. So the people in my circle now are much more minimalistic in their lifestyle and habits. So creative capital is a huge one. And wayfinding, I think the thing that I'm most deeply curious about is people that are able to create their own structures of fulfillment when they're whether they're creating something out of a blank canvas or they're following very untraditional models of success, which is what I'm following.
And talk a little bit about your model of success after you left banking, and what was that, in like 2017 or so?
Yeah. I think it was very much based on sort of the Daniel Pink book, which was I wanted autonomy, I wanted purpose, and I wanted something to feed my sense of agency and new growth. I'm still in process on this journey, Alan, because I have, as part of my storytelling community, we've done about 33 salons or 31 salons, but yet I still seem to benchmark myself to old metrics of success, which is very strange because nothing that I'm doing right now has financial metrics associated with it or KPIs. It's a very sustainable, self-regulated life. As much as I sought it in 2017, this is what I wanted. I wake up every day and I'm my own boss of my own time, in my own space, and my life is well balanced. I still have this very gnawing sense of dissatisfaction, which means that my formula for success is not yet coherent. I haven't internalized what I had logically said, this is the life that I want. It's the honest answer. I'm sorry, I don't have a sexy answer for you on this one. And I'm 4 years in, and part of it is also because in the creative process, first off, you don't write books to become a best-selling New York Times bestseller. You talk to anyone that is learning to write. You don't put such deterministic goals. And every day you show up, and you sometimes will not have anything to talk about or write about, but you still have to show up. So it is more about the practice and not the product. Whereas for my last how many ever years, it's been all about the product and not so much the practice. Right. So I'm still in the process of kind of remaking what that sense of success is. If you ask me, I think I would be happy to say that if I've found true fulfillment in just showing up and not worrying that there's not a product yet in the imminent horizon.
What were your metrics of success pre-2017?
It was all about as a salesperson, was I in the top 10? Was I one of the best salespeople? I mean, and was I a top 10 producer? Did I have top 3 wallet share with my top 5 clients? And in this hedge fund job, we were raising a fund. It was about, were we raising a sizable fund, and, were investors happy? Very clear metrics. You know what I mean? And now to kind of be trying to find your way around, because some of this stuff takes years. Like a good, meaningful work of art or writing, it can take years. And so I don't have a formula. And more importantly, I don't have a bunch of people breathing down my neck saying, you have to do this. See, that was also a little bit of accountability building. You know what I mean? I kind of didn't want to let people down. So I showed up and I would bat hard and be part of a team. But now it's just you, with your worst critic on your left or your right shoulder every day.
How do you know you're making progress, or do you care right now?
I think that I really would like to just have a very consistent sense of identity in just the practice. I would consider it a victory if you talk to me a year later and I say, yeah, Alan, I hang my hat on saying that I'm a writer. I say now that I am an investor. I think it took me a few years to acknowledge that. But I would be thrilled if a year down the line I can be like, yeah, I'm to think that, I'm a writer. It's messy, but I wake up every day and I have a sense of meaning and purpose from what I do.
So your LinkedIn profile, I don't know if it's intentional, but it says you're an investor, writer, social entrepreneur, and corporate. Do you consider yourself an investor first, or is that just on your LinkedIn?
I'm an investor first, and I use it metaphorically. I invest in everything: money, people, relationships, stories, communities.
How do you
decide? And I think honestly, I will be, now that I think about it, I think I've already hit a metric of success, because if I had to die tomorrow and if someone asked me, I would say actually it was job well done. I think I did a lot of good investing throughout my life.
Yeah.
The writer is, I think I really hesitate to call myself that because my practice is not solidified. Until I have a solid practice, I have a solid or robust yoga practice. I have a very robust, I think about the markets in a certain way. I don't yet on writing. I do these salons somehow there. I should put that second, actually, if you ask me, because we have a self-sustaining startup on a very lean budget that has done incredible programming over 4 years.
What are salons? You've mentioned it several times.
So they're inspired by the French Enlightenment salons, where women, when they didn't have access to university, they would bring in the university into their living room. They had artists and thinkers kind of create a network of knowledge and ideas. But pre-pandemic, we would literally meet in the living rooms. And the format was you would have an artist, there would be a performance of some sort for 30 minutes, and then we would spring it off into some kind of a facilitated workshop / experiential learning session, where we essentially were trying to get people to de-thaw the mask that they have to wear outside at work and in society, and come in and just show up. And now they're just on Zoom. It's the gift that I talked about. Every salon really tries to create a safe space for people to show up and be curious and not worry about being successful or having to be impressive. They just show up to be themselves.
So how much freedom, it seems like you're quite autonomous now, and you're choosing your path to write, invest, create, and work on these salons. How much do you think your success financially early on has afforded you this in the last 4 years?
Everything. I don't think I would have pulled the plug on corporate career if I didn't have a good sense that I was going to be financially sustainable. Once I reached a certain baseline of that I could live on this without really eating into my savings is when I made the decision to do this. That's who I am, in the sense that I can be a risk taker up to a certain point, but I have solidly middle class values. I don't want to be, it's the same value of autonomy. I never want to be dependent on someone else.
And yet it sounds like in your career, I don't know if you were dependent on them, but you leveraged a lot of these relationships. You leveraged a lot of these sponsors to get promoted, to get opportunities. So you weren't dependent on them, but they were very critical to your success.
Yeah. I think I'll have a harder time asking for the order in that true sense now. I think I'll have a harder time asking to be employed now.
A harder time asking what?
To be employed for a job, for an opportunity.
Do you think you could ever work for someone again?
I don't know. I don't ever want to say never, but I think that it doesn't really appeal to me. This agency of time and space, I've concluded, holds a huge key to creativity and happiness for me.
Yeah.
It has to be like a near perfect alignment. And also, by the way, Alan, I'm a firm believer that beyond 5 hours a day, I'm pretty like unproductive. So I'm not entirely sure that I want to find a job anytime soon that allows me to be like fully engaged and just be outcomes based and like do something for 5 hours a day.
So you're at a very fortunate stage. You busted your hump for about like 15 years, I guess, from like
14, yeah.
So, and you were successful. You were able to accumulate a nice nest egg for yourself.
Yeah.
Not everyone can do that.
No. It's a position of great privilege. I am a big fan, and I think the world is changing. My sister is, and I have a lot of friends that are similarly free-spirited, that are able to do what I think other people can access, which is, I think I'm a huge believer in taking a 3 to 4 month sabbatical every 4 years or so. Even if you're in a job, I think that, and I also don't think that this life of freedom is for everyone, by the way. It sounds really awesome. It's not. Every day when you wake up and you're like, oh shit, what am I going to do for the remaining 10 hours when the rest of the world is at work, especially in New York City, right? Like, it's not really that much of it. It's not that dreamy a life, but I would say that to really continue to invest in, a lot of people when they work, I think the one thing that they forget is they don't look at their money. So to make sure, one of the only pieces of advice I have to give people is that please pay attention to how your money is invested. Even if it's a modest, you're maxing out just your 401k, be fully aware of where your money is going and how it's growing.
What did you do early on, and what do you advise people on that? Like I was fortunate. My dad always taught me, like, I knew about 401ks before I even graduated college. And as soon as I got my first job when I was 21, I maxed out my 401k, and it's grown nicely over the course of time. What advice, like, either invest early or like do you give other people? Because I don't know how repeatable it is to tell people bust your ass for 14 years and then you can do whatever the hell you want.
No, I don't think it's repeatable, actually. I mean, I think you have to be in a high paying job in that sense, I think, but don't underestimate the value of just consistently investing. It doesn't even need to be probably invested in a very sexy portfolio, so to speak. So living within your means. I mean, I think that I almost always, from the very get-go, even when I was making a lot of money, I was probably saving about 50% of my salary. So I've always 50% of my salary.
Right.
Like, I was always very frugal. And I mean, I obviously also, by the way, I'm not like vacationing and staying at the Ritz-Carlton now. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, I've made some clear trade-offs on like what this life entails, right? Which also means that I don't eat out that much. You know, I try to be very slim and lean in this framework. I would say that to invest every year to max out all your kind of tax exempt options that you have available to you. And even if you're just invested in a broad kind of diversified index, and I think that the minute your assets or your savings hit more than $250,000 to $300,000, don't be afraid to like consult with a financial advisor. And the second thing I'll also say, because we live in a high tax region, there's a huge amount of leakage that goes through taxes. So be very mindful of how tax efficient how you're managing around your taxes. But I think that there's no substitute for living frugally and simply, as far as I'm concerned. If my spending is not adding any value or purpose or meaning to my life, I don't. And the second I would say is be very aware of what I call tail risks. What I mean by that is make sure that you have the right kind of insurance in your life. For instance, don't lose a whole ton of money on something stupid like that. And this third thing I would say is be consistently invested and don't time the market. Be consistently invested.
Yeah, so that's great financial advice. What about on the career front, when you're speaking to people that are just starting out in their career, 21, maybe coming out of school or a lot earlier in their career? What career advice do you give? Like, I'm guessing part of it's about building that network and building those relationships, but what other advice do you offer people when they seek it?
I will say that, very keenly I think that we all have multiple facets and sides to us, and there's probably multiple careers in us, is the honest answer. And I think especially for the generations that come after us, I suspect that people will not necessarily have like 15 years in technology. It's probably going to be more customary for people to rotate between disciplines. I would say to build a very interdisciplinary skill set, to definitely hone in on like sales skills, meaning we all are salespeople. The ability to tell a good story is very important. I think to hone in on understanding really how you make decisions and why you make decisions, and having a very clear compass on your decision making, I think is important. Third thing I would say is your career is not forever. And early on, if you really have the ability to be an entrepreneur early on in your life versus later on in your life, I think I would recommend you take more creative and entrepreneurial risks earlier on in your life. Always invest in people, but I try to say invest in relationships and potential partnerships. Don't think about it as networking, really. No amount of money is too or less, like in terms of like investing in that sense, right? Like I said about the financial resourcing. And I think that you constantly have to be learning. And so if it's micro learning of some sort, like, it's either skill building or not, just make sure that you're pushing the envelope of your own discomfort of what you don't know. If there aren't areas that don't have you deeply curious or where you don't know, I think then you have a huge blind spot. So you kind of want to focus on that. I think in terms of just basic skills, I think that you want to just have exposure to storytelling, or like, visual and not visual, sorry. It's like just storytelling, being able to craft a good narrative, crafting a good story. I think good salespersonship is probably very, very important, and have a very darn clear sense of values, which, by the way, that compass takes years and years to build. And the last thing I want to say is don't be afraid to cut your losses. What I mean by that is a career that is not clicking for you early on, even though it seems like the rightest thing for you. If it's a huge sap on your energy, I promise you it's affecting your relationships outside and your personal health. Cut your losses. Your energy should be one of your key indicators on what actually, like, where your sweet spot.
Yeah. How have you been so comfortable in cutting your losses, and what do you think prevent other people from being as comfortable with cutting their losses? Because it's easy for me. I've done it plenty of times. Seems like it's easier for you. I've spoken to some folks that it's not as easy for. What do you think to you, perhaps from others that are not that
just practice, Alan, to be honest? Like, I don't think, maybe being an immigrant and having to leave your family early on, and that was a deep sense of relationship capital lost right early on, I think it kind of built a certain kind of muscle. But also remember, though, like, I have lost a lot in my last 14 years as it concerns human relationships. And I've learned deeply from all of that. So I wasn't necessarily very good. A lot of my earlier cutting my losses were based on fear, which is not necessarily a very healthy thing to like kind of come out of. But now I think my compass is pretty much, if this is aligned with my values, it's made it easier for me. I'm a relationships and truth and love and beauty kind of person first, meaning if anything is kind of keeping me up at night in a way where it does not feel healthy, it's easier for me to do that because I have a much stronger compass of what my alignment barometer is.
Yeah.
I mean, but I wasn't always that good, though. You know what I mean? I cut my losses because I was acting out of fear in some cases as well. But I learned something from that because I survived, see? And that gives you, in a strange way, like a sense of confidence.
Yeah. And it eliminates the regret if you look at mistakes as learning opportunities rather than,
yeah.
As long as you're growing from it.
And I also spent a lot of time building my compass of self-awareness. I was in therapy for 7 to 8 years. My yoga practice was very instrumental to self-observation, and it's a deeply spiritual practice in a different way. It's a very self-discovering practice, right? So I have a very clear sense of who I am now from having spent all of that time. Self-awareness is also not that easy to develop. I mean, you have to really commit time. Talk about investing in yourself, investing in your self-awareness, and investing an even deeper amount of time in your blind spots and knowing where the ones are going to get you.
How do you identify your blind spots? Does someone else have to spot them for you and call them out, or how do you identify them yourself?
I almost always have to. I mean, you're unfortunately in the echo chamber of your own. I mean, unless it's a pattern, right? Like, for instance, my blind spots typically will originate from, I'm a people pleaser. Okay. So I did the self-saboteur test. And one of my 2 characteristic sabotaging things are hypervigilance. I'm always over catastrophizing, and people pleasing. So some of the toughest decisions that I've not made have been because I've been afraid of offending someone or pissing off someone. So I know that to be a blind spot. Like, so if I have to give up on a job or an opportunity, I know for sure that I will first go through a period of, oh shit, I don't want to say no to them. Right. So I know that. But mostly, like, when I'm making a decision where it's not clear to me, I will consult 1 or 2 people for sure.
Yeah. And so last question I have for you, because I know we're running a little late here, and I have my bourbon. I've been drinking mine, but you've been doing most of the talking. Yeah, you've been doing most of the talking, so I feel bad you haven't been able to drink yours. But outside of listening to yourself and the self-awareness, I think you alluded to before that you may listen to podcasts or other things. Are there things that either books or podcasts that inspire you that you recommend to others as well to learn and grow? And
yeah, so I love a lot of stuff that Daniel Pink writes. I loved The Power of Habit. So I'm a big fan of learning and development being a function of habit formation. So anything in the genre of habit making and habit formation, I'm a huge fan of. The Power of Habit was probably the first book that I read. I have a bunch of books on habit that I try to pick up. Tim Ferriss, as much as I do find him obnoxious at times, I will listen to some of the podcasts because, he's kind of that same kind of accelerated learning ilk. One of my soul-filling podcasts is always on being. It's with Krista Tippett, because that kind of deeply speaks to my creative practice. The other book that I wanted to say was when I was in the process of making a change, Designing Your Life by the Stanford guys, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. That book was very seminal in kind of navigating change making and wayfinding.
What's the name of that book?
Designing Your Life. I think that Tim Ferriss and Hidden Brain, because Shankar Vedantam, I'm paying attention to the neuroscience of the way we are wired as human beings. And he does a lot of stuff on behavioral thinking and on neuroscience, which I really love.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, you're the second person that brought up The Power of Habit. Someone else brought up Atomic Habits.
I have Atomic Habits.
Yeah. Is there one that's better than the other?
I haven't read James Clear yet. I used to follow his blog. I think that for someone that doesn't want to read, The Power of Habit is very seminal for me because they go into the psychology of how, like, this whole thing about influencing consumer behavior kind of led to this whole science of how, you are influenced.
Yeah. So have you read Influence by Bob Cialdini?
No. Should I?
Yeah. Robert Cialdini, Influence. It's a really long book, but it's really good.
Definitely.
Cool. I will add these to my list, definitely. Well, Nirupa, it was a fantastic conversation, and it was really interesting to hear your perspective and your almost like 2 different portions of your life. And we didn't even talk about your childhood, everything before Wall Street, but it's a fantastic story, and you're very thoughtful about everything and introspective, and that probably came from life experience, 7 years of therapy, and the network and the assets that you built through your network. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your story, your advice, your tips, and I learned a lot today, so thank you.
Thank you, Alan. The conversation is only as good as the interviewer, so thank you for being so deeply curious and generous in your attention and listening and asking.
Cool. Well, it's always nicer to spend time with you than my family at dinner where they're just shouting at each other. But I love my family, but it's nice to have adult conversations sometimes.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
A great adult conversation with Nirupa, and a very special thanks to you, our listeners. Now, first chance you get, connect with Alan at sickpodcast.com. Alan, what is to be expected if one signs up for the newsletter?
Every week, every hump day, you will receive great information about how to accelerate your career. We talk about the podcast. We talk about some good tips of how to get great jobs, great opportunities. And we always have cute pictures of either my pups or other pets out there. So if you have good pets, send them my way. they can be featured in one of the upcoming Accelerator newsletters.
All right, but no pictures of your kids trying to parallel park. So on the website,
No.
click that link.
We would get too many unsubscribes if we did that.
There's a link that says sign up for the Kadima newsletter. Click that at sickpodcast.com. That's SYCK. For Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba. We hope you've enjoyed this Sick Podcast episode, and you are going to love the next one.